Well, welcome back to another episode of The Miles Driven. This time we're doing proper off-roaders. We've done depreciated SUVs, and in the future I'm going to have a plug-in hybrids SUV episode 2, but this time we're concentrating on those vehicles that you buy if you really need that off-road performance. And we are going to have diesels, V8s, and we're even going to have an electric car in there, although I think the electric one will be a pretty left-field choice. We're going to get straight into it, but throughout here I'm going to be going through 8-year depreciation, average mileage vehicles. There are some real bargains, by the way, as we go through the list. I'm going to be mentioning wading depth and approach and departure angles as well. So if you really do need to go properly off-roading, you can go and say, actually, that's a bit of a bargain at 8 years old. And the reason we concentrate on 8 years old is because it's when vehicles are just new enough that they should be in good shape as long as they've been well cared for, but they've lost that big chunk of their value. Now, there are one or two exceptions throughout the list, which we're going to start with. This vehicle, so the whole list has US, UK depreciation, okay? But I wanted to include the first one just as an example as how sometimes cars that just get something special about them and are not sold for that long can just hold on to their value. So it is the Suzuki Jimny. It's the JB74 chassis, the 3-door model, between 2018 and 2020. They sold this as a non-commercial vehicle, so it had back seats. There's actually a drive on the channel. I was in Sweden with my uncle and my cousin, and we all fit in this car. And bearing in mind, I'm 6'8", my uncle's 6'5", my cousin's 6'4", and all of us are crammed into this little Suzuki. And it worked. You know, I mean, probably not something we'd do on a very, very long drive, but for such a little package, it's a proper little scrambling off-roader. Now, because they only sold it for a short period of time, I say none got to North America. In the UK and Europe, we got it for 2 years. The Aussies, I think you managed to keep it, although the commercials are also quite popular over there. And in Europe and in the UK, we get a commercial model after 2020. There's some emission things going on there. But if you want the one that has back seats, you're pretty much going to be paying the price of brand new. I managed to find some with sort of 5% off, 10% off, but really, these things, they hold their money incredibly. Now, there is no official wading depth on them, okay, but there is a departure angle, so an approach angle of 37 degrees and a departure angle of 49 degrees. So proper off-roader. I wouldn't take it through, you know, too much of a Ford, but apart from that, I think you could have a proper little off-roader here. Now, we're going to move on from there because, as I say, that one was a bit of a left field choice, and I only really picked that one because every now and again, cars, you can buy them new and just own them. And for whatever reason, people just keep loving them, even as they age, and they never really lose a lot of their money. And that was a good example. But everything after this has proper depreciation. So, the Ford Ranger, and I've looked at this in Raptor specifications. So the Raptor didn't go over to the US. You got the Ranger model. We've got the Ranger model in Australia, in Europe, in the UK as well. But for the Aussies, for the Brits, and a few Europeans, you also got the diesel version of the Raptor. Now, these in the UK and Europe are about 30 to 35% off for the Raptor variation. In the US, you're looking at similar depreciation, can be quite a bit more than that if you go for the very base models, but sort of mid-level models, you're looking at about 40-45% depreciation. So the Raptors are holding their money a little bit better, but there isn't a direct comparison for the US. 850 millimeters or 33.5 inches of official wading depth on the Raptor model. I should stress that that's on the Raptor model, which had different suspension, different wheels. Okay. Approach angle 32.5 degrees. Departure angle was 24 degrees. That's because of the longer overhang. So you can see how overhangs really do make a big difference to if you are going to be off-roading, you know, in hilly or gorgy areas. Then something with a really short overhang, like that little Jimny, can make a big, big difference. Now, I know this first generation, it went to the US very, very late, so you don't get as much choice. There is a buyer's guide on the channel for the Ranger, and there I sort of mentioned, I think it's the last couple of years you get over in the US, but the Aussies, this was a particular popular car, and I think it's always worth mentioning on the Ranger, this is an Australian designed vehicle. Okay, so while the F-150 and all the big trucks, they're American, we don't really do them at all in Europe, although we do sell them. The actual design, the sort of ground up build of this is Australian. So while Ford may not build in Australia anymore, they certainly still design. So just a nice bit of history there and continued legacy for the Australians. Now, third on the list, This one's going to be a lot more popular, I think, in the US than anywhere else, but it is the Jeep Wrangler Rubicon, the JK variation. I looked at 2015, so a little bit older here. So I was looking at between specifications. Interestingly, you can go down to about 45% depreciation in both the UK and the USA. I did see them a little bit stronger than that. So mileage is going to be a factor here. What I usually do when I'm working out the depreciation is I'll get all the data I can pull in, put it into the model, and then I'll sort of say, okay, let's get the outliers out of here. But every now and again, that's difficult because sometimes you find that particular cars don't get driven as much as others. Whether that's just the initial buyers, second buyers are using them for sort of shorter trips or whatever it may be, or they live in cities, or for whatever reason, they generally trend to slightly lower mileage, and some of them have quite high specification. And all these things can mess around with residual values. So I did find up to about 35% for the stronger ones, but for the most part, for average mileage one, 45, possibly could get 46, 47% in the US. You will be able to find them cheaper. I did find some cheaper ones than that, but they were higher mileage. And I was really trying to focus on finding sort of the better ones, if you like, especially because I had to look that little bit older, around sort of 15, 16, 2017 at the very latest on these particular Jeeps. 762 millimeters of wading depth, that's 30 inches exactly, and then 42.2 degrees approach angle and 32.1 degrees departure angle. So again, you can see the difference of that rear overhang, but at the front, very, very good approach angle. So if you live somewhere where you can get down off of whatever you've climbed up pretty easily and pretty steadily, then this could be a great pick. Now, the next one on the list, I think this is the one that people would have expected to be a bit higher up, but I think it's probably because of the engines that it is where it is. So you couldn't have an off-roader list without some particular manufacturers, okay? And I tried really hard to, if I say depreciation and off-road, I think everyone thinks of Land Rover, but you can't have a fair list without having a few of its major competitors. And Toyota, I've put in the Land Cruiser, but actually I used the Land Cruiser Prado model. That's the J150 if you're in Europe and the UK. Now, the Prado in the US is a Lexus model. It's a Lexus GX460. There is a buyer's guide for that car. There's a buyer's guide for the Ranger. I think I mentioned that earlier as well. On this one, it was interesting because in the UK, we have the diesel engine in these, and the residuals are a bit stronger than in the US, where it's a higher spec brand, a Lexus, but for whatever reason, the residuals weren't quite as strong. So between 40 and 45% in the UK, 50 up to about 55% depreciation in the USA, and that was stretching it to about a 9-year-old example. Okay, approach angle, wading depth 700 millimeters at 27.6 inches. That's 31 degrees approach angle, and 25 to 28 on the departure angle. Depends whether you go for the Lexus or the Toyota, and depends on which specification you buy them in. Okay, this is a sort of a theme you'll hear me run through on some of these cars, is that because you get different body kits on certain models, some of them more sort of off-road biased and some of them less so, it can affect departure and approach angles. So I will mention it if it comes up. But I wanted to say, really interestingly on the Lexus and on the Toyota side, that I know while a lot of people will they'll look at these ones as ones they can modify. And what I mean by that is that if you're starting with a base of a vehicle that is known for its dependability and reliability, and you start to do things to it to push its performance, you are pushing it into a less reliable vehicle. That's just, every car on the road. If you take Formula One at the very top and the most basic Toyota Corolla at the very bottom, if you start pushing a vehicle made for transport, so 4 wheels and basically a box chassis, and you push it all the way up, performance, it splits at one point and you'll become a Dakar racer on this side and a Formula One car on the other. But each incremental step, you are sacrificing some reliability for additional performance, okay? And I think the interesting for me on the Land Cruiser, particularly for the Aussies, and then some of the sort of keen off-roaders in the US, was looking at this particular platform you can start to sort of push bigger wheels, more, more or sort of tougher suspension that has more travel within it. You can give them a little bit more abuse, and they will just keep rolling out the other side without needing a weekend's worth of work. And I'm not making any comments about any particular manufacturer there. I'm just saying that if you are looking to modify an SUV, I saw when I was looking through these, especially as you look to about the 10-year-old mark and a little bit older, people do start to do quite a lot to them. And that didn't help with figuring out the residual values, if I'm honest, but it also, it sort of spoke to a little bit more of what people think of these cars and that they can push them that bit further. Interestingly, if you look back at the Ranger Raptor, people don't really do a lot to them, and I think that's because they sort of came out the factory pretty much ready to go. So depending on how well equipped they are to really go at this off-roading challenge and how much the buyers of them want to actually make their car go further and further, you do see a little bit of a fine line separating the ones on the left and the ones on the right. And I'll try and mention if ones are one side or the other. Now, fifth on the list is the Mercedes G-Wagon. It would have been impossible to do a list of dedicated off-road vehicles and ignoring the G-Wagon, because we're looking at depreciation here, and because these vehicles start so expensive, even though they are extremely desirable. I think out of all of these vehicles, and I'm not suggesting for a second that you watching this who love going mud plugging on a weekend are a G-Wagon buyer, but I think possibly there is an image aspect to the G-Wagon that sort of means that if people do want to use them off-road, they are competing to buy them with people that don't, but they want the look that they can. And that really is the G-Wagon's market. And because of that, residuals were a little bit more all over the place, but specification was a big factor within that. Okay, so for the G-Wagon, this is the W463 chassis. So pre-2018, I looked at the 2015 to 2018s. In the UK, I was looking at the 350D model. In the USA, the 500 or 550 model. I can't quite remember off the top of my head, but you only have one of them. So that's the petrol V8 and then the 6-cylinder diesel for the UK. UK, 45 sort of top end, 55 as you went to more basic spec. The problem with the G-Wagon is you could put quite a lot of specification on them brand new. And so you did see a sort of 10, I'd probably say there was about 20% actually right at the top end to bottom end for a very similar car, depending on a few factors. Mileage, color was a big one on this actually, interestingly, and then specification and whether people had put lots of AMG sort of optional kit bits that either they'd stuck on themselves or Mercedes had put on. All of that seemed to have an effect. In the US, it was a little more concrete at the 50% mark, but after it all, I decided to go between 45 and 55%, so similar to the UK, because again, you can sort of push the numbers one way or the other, depending on the specification. Now, wading depth on this, 600 millimeters, so 23.6 inches. The approach angle, 36 degrees, departure, 27 degrees, but again, those figures can vary depending on which specification you buy and have you put on different things to the car, sort of side steps. There's some, I think you can put like the exhaust on the diesel, I think runs a little bit lower, the AMG body kit. So all these things do make a difference to some of that. But that was the one that if it's a very occasional off-road, but you want something that feels rugged on the road and certainly has a more luxury end feel, this seemed to be the pick. I know a few of you will be screaming by now, Land Rover, but we've only got to fifth on the list, and bearing in mind the depreciation is getting worse the further we go down, so you can't really expect Land Rovers to be up at this end. But yeah, I think the G-Wagon is really buoyed up by the fact that there are people in cities that want to own them as cars. That's true of a lot of off-roaders, but the G-Wagon, I think, it has more people that have more money to spend, and they're sort of between maybe an S-Class or a G-Wagon, and they go for a G-Wagon not because of its abilities, just because that's the image they want. There's nothing wrong with that. It's a free world, do what you want, but I think that just pushes up the prices a little bit stronger. Now, the next one on the list is not sold in the UK or Europe. it was a bit of a funny one to put in the list, and I don't think many people are going to be considering it for its proper off-road ability, but genuinely, it does have quite incredible off-road ability because they knew if they were going to make it, had to give it some special abilities to get out there. Yes, it's the Hummer EV, GMC Hummer EV. Really heavy depreciation actually on these. So these are 2022, 2021 cars that I was looking at. 47 to 52% depreciation. It's a big hit of depreciation. 200 kilowatt hour battery under these things, which I suppose in old Hummer fashion had to be incredibly inefficient. So I know many of you won't know too much about well, some of you might know lots about electric cars. I shouldn't assume actually, but good electric range on a car, 300 miles, which the Hummer claims that it can do. But usually it does that with a much smaller battery pack. So sort of 3 to 4 miles per kilowatt hour of the battery. That's good-ish. If you can do more than 4, that's where it gets sort of efficient. And you're sort of saying, oh, that's a very efficient car if it's doing more than 4. 1.5, 1 to 1.7 miles per kilowatt hour on one of these Hummers. So, they'll do the range, but it's going to take a long time to charge the thing up because it's got a massive battery pack, and then it's going to deplete it pretty quickly. But it had to go on there. It just got so many little specific off-road features, including this sort of crab feature and everything else like that, that I know are, at the end of the day, are probably just more marketing gimmicks to get people to buy it and who are never ever going to use it. But if you're watching in the US and you thought, oh yeah, I've got to have an EV, or for whatever reason you really like the look at these, they are bargains, 50% off after just 3 or 4 years, and they were not high mileage. Unlike most of the cars on this list, they had not done average mileage per year, so 10 to 12,000 miles per year I'd set as an average. These things had done like 15,000 miles in 4 years. So yeah, adds to the bargain. 660 millimeters of wading depth, 26 inches. That's quoted. I've sort of pulled it back from Hummer. They do quote up to 32 inches or 813 millimeters for the wading depth. You have to have the train modes active and a few other bits. But so there's sort of 2 figures on that one. Then departure angles. There are, again, depending on specification and depends on how you've set the ride height, and there's a lot of other sort of fancy trickery, but 47.9, 38.4, so 47.9 approach, 38.4 departure, but that's absolute maximum. The regular figures are below that. I think you've got to set the suspension into like an extreme mode that it's not going to hold, so just bear that in mind. Now the next car, again, I added this in because I know some Aussies are going to be watching this and saying, oh, come on, we've got to have this thing. If you've had the Land Cruiser, we've got to have one of these. But also we can get them in the UK. We just have to import them because we had the previous generation. We didn't have this generation. In the US, this was called the Armada, but it was also sold as an Infiniti QX80. It's the Nissan Patrol, okay? On the chassis, I think it takes it from about 2008 to 2020, something like that. So it's quite a long chassis run. These, I didn't get an exact figure for the UK only because they're imports, and quite wild how much variation there was. But what I would say is they were not crazy money, as in, like, sometimes you see imports that haven't come to the UK, but we're sort of bringing them in from Japan because we can, and because it's right-hand drive, we just sort of change the speedo, get it checked, either MOT'd or it has to have its VIC check, depending on its age. Is it VIC check or VOSA check? Anyway, it doesn't matter. If it's under 10 years, it has to go through an additional check. If it's over 10 years, just needs to have all the adaptations made to it and then run through an MOT. And because of that, you do see them over here, especially around 10 years old. But depending on whether it had history in Japan, depending on whether it had optional extras on it, all these things move the price quite a lot. And because there aren't that many around, some are quite expensive, some were cheaper. But in the US, looking more at the Infiniti, 55 to 60% depreciation. I did look at the Aussies, just so you know. And again, pretty wild variation, because in Australia these get sort of modified with big wheels and stuff like that. sort of 30% down to about 55% with average mileage. You can find them a bit cheaper if they've really done some mileage, especially if that mileage has been off-road. And you can find them a bit more expensive if they've been someone's sort of garage queen that they take out on the weekend. So 700 millimeter wading depth, 27.6 inches, and a 34 approach angle and a 26 departure angle. That's all from Patrol's official, Nissan's official figures for the Patrol, but there can be variations in market and depending on whether there was an off-road pack offered in your market. So while I'm sort of giving that, I've tried to be safe with these figures because, as I say, sometimes you can buy dedicated off-road packages, or if they are offered with air suspension in some markets, then obviously it changes things. So I've gone with official figures throughout the list. Next one on the list, probably the one that many of you have been waiting for, or at least one of the brands you've all been waiting for. And I did say we would get to Land Rover because off-road and heavy depreciation, there's not too many brands that are going to jump to people's minds. Sort of Land Rovers, Jeeps maybe, but yeah, Land Rover is probably going to take the title for this. I actually did, in the end, I took out one or two cars from the list that, because to be honest, as I ran it through, ran the original data set of about 40 cars. I could have just called this the depreciated Land Rover video because so many were there. So I sort of picked some out and I thought, no, I think there's, that's more sort of not looking for off-road buyers as much as a different car. So I did take a few out just to be fair, and so it wasn't just a Land Rover video. But number 8 on the list is the Discovery 5. Okay. Predominantly because the Discovery 5 is a little bit newer than the Discovery 3 and 4. However, the Discovery 4 does feature on this list in case you're waiting for it. This is the L462 platform. I looked at around the year 2017. Interestingly, for 2017, there are a few changes happening in Land Rover. So I'd probably look at 2018 if I was on the market. But just to keep it fair, I looked at 2017 as much as I could across this list. 50 to 55% depreciation in the UK. That's diesel engine models. In the USA, about 55% depreciation petrol engine models. Okay, 900 millimeter wading depth with the air suspension jacked up and wade. I think in some markets it needs a wade sensing option added to it. In other markets, that's just standard fitment. That's 35.4 inches in old school, 34 degree approach angle and 30 degree departure angle. So not the best, certainly not the worst, sort of one of the ones up there. Land Rover have always been really good with making sure that as their cars move up market and become more expensive, they can still do the job. And so not much overhang and allowing for sort of cut off and a step down so that they can actually sort of get up and down things. So interesting with the Discovery 5, I think this is probably the car that's a bit unloved. It was facelifted around 2020. There's a buyer's guide for the Discovery 5 on the channel. I think for a lot of people, it's fallen into a bit of a quagmire. The Defender comes out just a couple of years after this. The previous generation was the old school chassis that everyone loved. So for a few years, especially because Land Rover didn't really give it the best variety of engines, they could have given it more options and they decided not to, which is a bit of a shame. I think a Discovery 5 with a diesel V8, for example, would have been quite a tempting offer for a lot of people, but it probably would have cannibalized the Range Rover, and so we didn't get it. So just interesting. I think, as you'll see this in the buyer's guide, they sell it with a 2-litre diesel Ingenium engine. In some markets, probably would avoid that one. But aside from that, once you get to the V6 diesel has its problems, which I mentioned in the buyer's guide. The straight 6 diesel, though, that's a bit newer than this, so its depreciation isn't as strong. And actually, the interesting thing with Discovery is, just in case you're looking at this and thinking, oh, I don't want that one that old, I wonder if the newer ones follow that same trajectory, maybe 45% off, 40% off. No, there's quite a hard cut-off, actually, for the Discovery 5. There's a step, and that's the Defender comes out. Land Rover realise they're not going to sell as many Discovery 5s, so they decide to whack up the price of the Discovery 5, only sell it in higher trim specifications, and because of all that, there's not that many on the market, and so they hold their money actually reasonably well. Because if you want one, then you really have to want one to get it. So yeah. Next on the list, the Volkswagen Touareg. This is the 7P chassis model, 1517, sold in both the US, the UK, Europe, Australia. Very, very popular chassis. This is, I think, for the middle ground car, someone who wants an SUV, is going to do the city stuff, but is definitely going to be able to do the off-road stuff. Yes, there's a lot on this list where you could argue it, but the interesting thing with the Touareg for me is because it's come from a manufacturer that builds lots of cars rather than SUVs or off-roaders, the interior reminds me a lot more of a car. Okay. And so if this is sort of just a weekend thing, but you need it to be a family car, you know, you kind of need it to transform from a Volkswagen Golf into an off-roader at the weekends and then be a Volkswagen Golf for your commute. The Touareg is one of the cars that does a pretty good job of that. I think because of the diesel engine, this is sort of peak Dieselgate era for Volkswagen. I'm not saying the Touareg was, you know, one of the worst offenders or anything, but it just got caught up in that media storm. And particularly because I think this was one of the cars where Volkswagen brought the diesel engine over to the US and then quickly pulled it away. So depreciation, a little bit more notable in the US than it is in the UK because, you know, we still like these cars. And I think we still like the first generation. So they should have pretty good servicing and sort of specialists and everything for a number of years to come. So if you're thinking of these cars, you've got to sort of think of what's the network around them like. And Touareg should be pretty good. 60 to 65% depreciation in the UK with the diesel engine. So, you know, not a bad thing to be running around in one of those 8 years old with a diesel engine, average mileage. If you just want a car, say, do all the bits, but you can keep for quite a long time. In Europe, particularly because of how specialists are sort of set up around the world, we get a lot more sort of Volkswagen specialists in the UK. I know the Aussies get quite a few as well. And then depending on where you are in the US, but yeah, you should be able to keep that one going quite a long time. In the US, 63 to 68% depreciation. So, you know, it is a bit worse. I did find it up to about 72% in some cases, but there were a few stronger ones, so it pulled the numbers up a little bit. Interesting one with the weighting on this one. So 500 millimeters is standard. However, there was a off-road package that you could specify. So 580 millimeters if you got that one. So 19.7 inches up to 22.8 inches. There is quite a bit of variance on the approach and departure angles depending on specification, but I'm going to say 26 degrees front, 27 degrees rear. Can be some variation on that. So just bear that in mind depending on the spec that you buy. And number 10 on the list is the Jeep Grand Cherokee on the WK2 chassis. Really interesting one, this one, because of how diverse the specifications that Jeep gave this particular generation of Jeep. So the Grand Cherokee has an Overland and a Trailhawk model. These ones are better for off-roading. However, they have a Trackhawk and an SRT and all the models in between, which really do sort of fill out the Jeep model on this generation. Now, if you're looking for just one of the sort of more middle ground models, I did try and look for a Trailhawk or an Overland, but they're a bit rarer, a bit harder to find, fewer of them out there. So I sort of mixed that in along with some of the specifications, and I tried to avoid the ones that had already been modified because there are people out there that have already done big wheels and stuff like that on them. Average mileage, we're looking at 55 to 65% depreciation in the UK. That is generally speaking with the diesel engine. In the US, 66 to 71% depreciation, generally with the petrol engines. The Australians sit somewhere in between. 508 millimeters of weighting, it's 20 inches. That's what the US figure quotes is in Imperial. So 508 millimeters, although specification did seem to make a little bit of difference depending on which wheels you get and all this sort of stuff. So yeah, take that for what you will. Departure angles, 35.8 on the approach and 29.5, but again, depending on specification. I think of all the ones that we're going to pick out, if you are really keen on modifying the sort of 4x4 to sort of start with a reasonable base, but something that's pretty heavily depreciated, And particularly if in the US, because you've got more specialists around, more knowledge, if you like, around this chassis. This is probably one of those picks, one of those good to go for. However, what I would say is that I had to remove a lot of data for broken ones that had been modified for off-roading. And I don't mean if you take them off-roading, they'll break. I just mean that there were quite a lot out there that had maybe been pushed a bit too far, maybe hadn't had all the modifications they should have had to try and do the off-roading they've done. And the point really here is just be a little bit cautious with what you're buying and make sure if someone has done something to it, they really have taken the care and time to make sure it's done properly. Next up on the list is the Land Rover Discovery 4. And I know quite a few of you have been waiting for this. This is the last generation to have a separated chassis. The reason, by the way, the Defender is not on this list is because I was looking at a time period between the last of the old Defender and the first of the new Defender. And the last of the old Defender actually really held their money well because people really want them. So, it seemed more sensible to look at the Discoveries, particularly because the Disco 4, I've done quite a lot of on-road driving on the Disco 4, but I managed to have 2 experiences off-roading in these. One of them, actually 3, because one of them sort of separate to an off-roading experience, it was just sort of going off in the countryside. And the interesting thing with the Discovery is that it manages to fill in the gap. I think if Land Rover had ever given the Discovery 4 more engine options, it possibly would have just cannibalized a little bit too much off of Range Rover, because towards the end, it was that car that if you want that sort of old school off-road prowess that people went for. And so I think the engine's limited a little bit. You can kind of see it in depreciation. So in the UK, 70 to 75%. That's for a 2015 model with an SD V6 engine. In the US, I was looking at the supercharged V6 models, 75 to 80% depreciation, 700mm wading depth, 35 degree angle for approach. 36 degree angle for approach. And then I really didn't know whether to put this one in because it's been in several of the buyer's guides. So, sorry, not the buyer's guides, the depreciation videos. But when you say off-road, depreciation, and luxury, there is only really one car, isn't there? The L405 generation Range Rover. And I looked at the Vogue SE model. You can get these now 8, 9, 10 years old, 73 to 78% depreciation in the UK, 70 to 75% depreciation in the USA. I think the figure's slightly stronger in the US because generally they're higher specification. They're supercharged V8s that I was looking at rather than the diesel V8s in the UK. But even so, yeah, I think it's just a case of the ones I was looking at. Maybe in 3 months' time, those figures would have moved slightly. I certainly did find slightly cheaper ones in the US, but they were not average mileage. So, and in the UK, yeah, despite being diesels, 8, 9, 10-year-old Range Rovers seem to all have roughly average mileage on them. Now, it has a 900mm wading depth, that's 35.4 inches, and a 34.7 degree approach angle and 29.6 departure angle. You need air suspension, by the way, to get all of those figures, which I think should be standard in most markets, but just in case it wasn't, or if it's been removed, seen a couple of adverts for these removed. But at the end of the day, the great thing with any Range Rover is that, generally speaking, and with the right tyres on it, you should be able to follow most of the cars on this list far off into the bush or wherever else, but you'll be doing it in a big leather captain's chair, feeling king of the world. Now, people make their jokes about, oh, you can go in, but you won't be coming back out. Well, realistically, most people that take care of their Range Rovers do have good ownership experiences. Otherwise, they wouldn't sell them anymore. So there you go. But yeah, actually, the thing I noticed on these was I would be willing to pay a little bit more. I know I've mentioned the depreciation. I'd be willing to go a little bit higher than that just to find the really, really well-kept ones, because that probably could make or break a day out off-roading wherever it is that you're pleased to go. Now, for the 2 wild cards on the list, we've got chalk and cheese. You really couldn't get 2 more opposing cars. One of them, maybe arguably the new school of way of doing things, the other, really the old school. And these are newer vehicles, which is why they're wildcard picks. The first is the Rivian R1T. A launch model has lost between 40 to 50% of its value. And these are pretty new cars. Similar story to the Hummer EV. You can get a fairly new car, pretty low mileage. And if you need to wade, if you live with a Ford around, with a moat around you or something, and you every day have to go fording through it, 1100 millimeters, 1.1 meters of wading depth on this, 43.3 inches you can wade through. And I guess that's the heavy battery pack that's sort of spread out across the floor and it doesn't need to breathe. So yeah, it's not going to float and it can just sort of keep going until you're up to the windscreen, I guess. You've got to have all the sort of correct off-road kit for it. Rivian did give a few different figures, but that was the one that I stuck on. 35.5 degree approach angle and 30 degree departure angle. So proper off-road numbers here for the R1T. But the fact that it's battery, I think, is the real leader here as to why it's facing such heavy depreciation. Now, on the other end of the scale, and I think this is an advert really for how we started and at the end, that if you build something that people really want, you can sell it and keep selling it, but you'll only have a very small slice of the market. If you want to sell a car that everyone's going to buy, you build a Volkswagen Golf or a Toyota Corolla. If you want to build a car for just a few people, then you build something like this, the Ineos Grenadier, and I looked between sort of 2023, 2024, so really new cars, but similar age really to the Rivians, and these things are like 10% off, 15% off, found one or two 20% off, but they're holding their value, really holding their value. The enthusiasts that are buying them seem to either be holding on to them, or if they're selling them, they're just getting another one. And really the only thing that was moving the price around was sort of desirable options, paint color, things like this. So 800 millimeter wading depth, 31.5 inches, and 35.5 degree approach angle, 36.1 departure angle. So if you want a proper off-roader, and the Ineos Grenadier can only be described as probably, you know, of all on this list, the one that really is trying to attract the proper off-roader. Maybe there's a few there, but I think all the other cars are trying to at least do some on-road driving. The Ineos really sort of said, no, this is an off-road car. If you want to drive it on the road, that's fine. But if you need to go off-road, this is what you buy. And they're holding their money fantastically well. So that's the end of the list. We do have a list, if you want to check out the other ones. There's luxury cars, SUVs. I did electric cars recently, sports cars, and we're going to be doing sort of plug-in hybrid SUVs. I know a few people have asked for that, and hybrids in general, along with a few other videos like this coming up. Or there are buyer's guides across the channel. There's a buyer's guide for the Range Rover that I mentioned, along with the Discovery 4 and many of the other cars I have mentioned. If you've enjoyed the video, consider subscribing, and I shall see you in the next one.